All right, so we are here with U.S. Congressman Sean Casten, representative from the 6th District. Just wanted to talk a little bit. Obviously, you don't have an opponent in the Democratic primary that's coming up here in March, but you're about halfway through your first term in Washington, D.C., and it's been a bit tumultuous. It seems like, as has been the case really since 2015, 2016, there's been so much focus on the president, the State of the Union speech, and a lot of the controversy that followed that, the impeachment trial, the refusal to call witnesses, and all of the allegations that have really reinforced a lot of the divisions in this country. I wonder, looking ahead to the fall, when you will have an opponent, how large a factor in the race will the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, how big a factor will that be, do you think?
I don't, for whatever gifts I have, mind reading isn't one of them.
Yeah.
Guessing at what's going to matter to voters, we'll see what matters to the voters. What I hope and what I take a certain amount of inspiration from is that I think both parties agree that the overwhelming majority of Americans are good people who believe in democracy and believe in the Constitution, and that if you make sure that all Americans are educated, they will elect people of good character and high civic virtue. And the reason I say that I think both parties agree with that is because if you believe in those things and you have values that are at odds with where the American public is, what do? And you basically do what Trump and the folks around him have done, which is to spread mistruths, to work hard to suppress votes. And I know in this district Trump is not very popular, which reassures me that the people in this district also believe that we should elect people that hold themselves to a higher ethical standard. I don't think that informs who they should vote for at any race on the ticket, other than, with respect to Trump. But I do think that the voters here want to see people who will be in office, will allow them to go to sleep at night, wake up in the morning, and not feel like the first thing they have to do is turn on the news and find out whether anything disastrous happened overnight from the White House.
When you took office, I know you hadn't been in Congress before.
Mm-hmm.
Had you held elected office before?
Never.
You're a businessman. You owned your own company. How have you found working in Washington to be different than the business world?
What I find is that it's actually a heck of a lot more like the rest of the world than people think from the outside. I think I've done 26 town halls or so now, and I typically lead them off by telling people that I think a part of my job is to demystify Washington, because the lens that people see Washington through is the lens of what gets eyeballs on television, and usually it's two people yelling at each other, because you get eyeballs on television with two people yelling at each other. The reality of the job, I joke, my wife works at Zurich Insurance, and I joke with her that we both have the same job. We're both middle managers in 8,000 person organizations, right? And if you think about, how you would do your job if you're a middle manager at Zurich, and this is not about my wife per se, but, or even at this newspaper, you got a project you want to get done. You know that in order to get the project done, you've got a few people who you need to work with to get it done. And you know that two of them have some personal history that they don't, there may be some issues that they don't work well together, but you know that this should align with their interests, and you work through that and figure out how to get it done. And if you do this at the newspaper, if you do this at, prior jobs I had, that's just part of the job. It's not really that different in Washington to get things done, except that the people that I work with are on television and have a certain degree of fame. And so, so the public has some view of like, well, how did you get Maxine Waters to come on board with you on this that's at odds, or how did you get Adam Schiff, or, which makes it seem like a much more mysterious job. But the reality is it's a big organization with a lot of middle managers that has a lot of responsibilities to get done. And you need people who can play in the sandbox with each other and figure out how to navigate that, and know that if you and I agree on this thing, let's work on that together. And we don't have to pollute that with some other thing that we may not agree on, but let's just go and work to get it done.
when you talk about working to get things done, what are some things that you have gotten done for the district, and the about a year that you've been in office so far? What are some things that you still hope to accomplish before your term is up?
So, look, the reason I'm in this job is because I am deeply concerned about climate change, and the fact that that was a priority in my prior professional career doesn't mean it stopped being a priority once I got into this line of work. Washington's a very seniority-driven system, but it's also a place where there's a deep recognition, in my experience, that with all of the things we have to deal with, if you have a member who has expertise in that, make sure they're in the room, because we need that expertise when we have it. And so it's I take a fair amount of pride and a bit of humility with the fact that the speaker put me on the Select Climate Committee, asked me to join her in Madrid to go represent the United States at the climate conference, met with the King of Spain, and you sit down and the speaker says, "Sean, why don't you lead the meeting?" which was pretty neat. In the course of that, have passed bills out of the Science Committee to the Clean Industrial Technology Act that's bipartisan and bicameral, which would create an agency at the Department of Energy to figure out how to decarbonize hard to decarbonize industries. This all started because I made the observation when I got there that everybody committing to be zero carbon by X is being irresponsible if they can't also tell you, how are we going to make fertilizer? How are we going to feed people without fertilizer? How are we going to make cement? How are we going to make steel? You can't just make a promise, you have a path to get there. And led that, got that done. Have another bill that we just introduced, the Energy Prices Act, which is designed to address something that's very material to Illinois, but we've talked about clean energy entirely the wrong way. We've talked about this as how will we afford to convert to clean energy. The reality is that markets are building clean energy plants all over the country because they're cheaper to run. If you don't have to pay for fuel, you make money in the long term. And what's happened is that as we've deployed so much clean energy on the grid, the CO2 emissions from the power sector are down by almost 30%. The price of power has fallen by 6%. And we're getting to a point where, because the consumer has benefited so much from cheaper energy, which is awesome, the investment thesis for new energy is getting squeezed. And in a nutshell, that's what the Exelon debate is right now. They had these assets that were running and were affordable, and the price of electricity has fallen down so much that they're not making money on the margin. That's a good problem to have. But what the Energy Prices Act did was say to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission that within your enabling legislation in the 1935 Federal Power Act, you have to take into account more things than just consumer prices, and you need to factor these things in so that we make sure we still have an incentive to invest in new technologies. That's on the climate side. We passed on the, healthcare was a huge issue in this race, and bills we've done to allow Medicare to negotiate prescription drug prices, actions we've taken, which I wish we didn't have to take, to defend the ACA in court, because some of the litigation that the Trump administration has essentially refused to engage in the Texas lawsuit. And so as a result, we have been defending that in court and had to give ourselves the authority to do that. And then lastly, this is a district where the Republican tax bill was a huge issue in the last race. People here were really angry at the way that salt cap impacted their taxes. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the very first bills I introduced with Lauren Underwood was a bill to significantly reduce that. We worked with Ways and Means Committee and a number of other ideas, and finally got a bill passed before last Christmas that would completely eliminate it, and would do so in a fiscally neutral way, because we took a commitment, unlike the prior Congress, that we're not going to raise taxes. We're not going to do anything that would be fiscally harmful. So, since eliminating the salt cap will reduce federal income, we funded it by restoring the top marginal tax rate to make sure that the whole thing pays for itself. All those bills are, the CETA is through Science Committee. The Energy Price Act is coming. I've got a huge carbon price bill that's coming shortly thereafter. The salt cap elimination was passed on the floor. I would hope that Mr. McConnell would take up all of them, but I can't control what happens in the Senate.
Right. And you brought up a few things that I wanted to ask you about. Your work with the climate crisis. Mm-hmm. committee. What, because I do know that was, as you said, a really central part of your campaign. What came of that? Can you describe some of the work that was done there?
So we have one deliverable, which is to prepare a report for the Congress. The power and the strength of that committee is we have no jurisdiction. The power and the weakness, I should say. It's a weakness because we do not have the ability to write laws from that committee. It's a strength because one of the great frustrations and limitations of Congress, I think, in general, is that committee jurisdiction is often insufficiently broad for what it regulates. You can't do energy policy and ignore taxes, which means you have to have the Ways and Means Committee. You can't do energy policy and ignore energy markets, which means you have to have energy and commerce. You can't do energy policy and ignore capital markets, which means you have to have financial services. We pass all these bills that are sort of done through committee and don't always stitch together well. And so our mandate as the committee is to write legislation that will be in a report that recommends legislation that says this bill has to be done and it would have to be crafted with these three committees in a holistic sense. So we've had a whole lot of hearings, field hearings, have worked up, I think, some pretty good ideas. Our final report will be released sometime in March. And
what's the ultimate goal of
So the ultimate goal is to really set the legislative agenda to make sure that we are doing what has to be done to avert a climate catastrophe.
What has to be done?
In my view, three things. The first is to recognize that we have an enormous opportunity because our economy is so much less efficient than so many of our competitors. Switzerland uses half as much energy per dollar of GDP as we do. So if we just got up to the Swiss level of performance, we would save a ton of money without using any more energy. Or in the alternative, grow our economy without using any more energy. You can figure out how you want to play that.
Well, so what makes us less efficient than the Swiss? I mean, is this like a European style type of thing where if I want hot water in my house, I got to turn on the water heater a half hour ahead of time?
It's a legacy of Band-Aid decisions. If you rank all the countries in the world on their efficiency, the least efficient countries are the ones whose economies depend on resource extraction because their economy grows by using as many resources as possible. The most efficient are the ones that aren't blessed with an abundance of natural resources, like Japan, like Switzerland. And the United States is much closer to Qatar than we are to Switzerland because our economy was founded on the basis of resource extraction. We have a lot of laws that are around that. Our economy today depends on resource conversion, but we really haven't updated our laws to reflect that. I mean, the IMF just came out and calculated that the United States subsidizes the fossil fuel industry every year to the tune of over $500 billion. That massively distorts capital markets. It makes us much more biased towards resource extraction and resource conversion. But it's a heck of an opportunity because it means we can actually save a lot of money by going through. But to come back, three things we got to do. One, at least double our efficiency. Two, figure out how to decarbonize those hard to decarbonize industries, which is what my CETA bill did. And then the third is we need to figure out how to get back to a level of atmospheric CO2 concentrations that we had in 1985. Because that's the last time that CO2 levels were at a level that was consistent with the 300,000 years of which our species has been maturing and building cultures. And we're so far beyond that point, and that means not only getting to net zero going forward, but probably a whole lot of agricultural practice changes that increase soil carbon retention and probably some other interventions. And those things are doable, but we don't have a lot of time left before we're going to be out of time. And so I think the challenge that we face is we didn't get into this situation through democratic processes, but the tools we have to get out of it are all dependent on majoritarian views. And I think one of the challenges we have as the committee is how we acknowledge the fact that what is necessary, if we're really honest, exceeds what is widely perceived as politically possible. And so how do we acknowledge that gap and how do we close the gap?
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Do you feel like the public values the climate work that you're talking about, and does that matter?
They absolutely do. It comes up an awful lot. This is an educated district, right? I mean, there's a lot of people who work at Fermilab in Argonne and UChicago. This is this is a place where people understand and respect science and recognize that you have to do what the facts say need to be done. So yeah, they do understand it. I think though that and your question is exactly why I raised the point about democracy. We do an awful lot of scientific things in this country that we don't presume to be predicated on whether or not the majority of the public supports it, right? We built up a whole semiconductor industry without worrying about whether the public understands quantum physics, right? Right? And I think we need to have a different conversation about climate that says when the science is unambiguous, if we say we can't act until 51% of the public and 60 senators agree, that's essentially an excuse for inaction, because we don't make that decision in any other scientific realm. We don't make that decision before we decide to send a probe to Mars. Right?
Yeah, I guess the one thing that I wonder is people do definitely mock when Donald Trump talks about you got to run your dishwasher 14 times or whatever, and at a surface level maybe that seems silly or whatever, but I think part of what he's trying to get at is that, especially as Americans, I mean, if you do travel to other countries, there's things that they don't necessarily do or have, and you notice them, like when you have a hot water heater that you got to turn on a hot water heater, when you got to turn something on in advance, if you want hot water, you got to think about it. Whereas at my house, I have it on demand, right? And I expect that convenience. Are there things that is the average American going to have to sacrifice anything, do you think, to address this?
Look, I think we have framed this as a conversation about sacrifice, which is completely wrong. And I'm not saying that as a matter of opinion. I'm saying that because I spent 16 years as a CEO of companies that was going into industrials, investing capital in their plants to make them more fuel efficient. I never once built a power plant that was less than at least twice as efficient as the electric grid, and I never built one that used new technology. And with one exception, I never sold it to people because I persuaded them to be more moral. I sold it to them because they were greedy. Mm-hmm. And there ain't nothing wrong with that. And that's why I said that this opportunity, when you look at countries that use so much less energy per dollar of GDP, mm-hmm. right? You're making a sacrifice if you say, I'm going to accept a lower standard of living, mm-hmm. right? Yeah. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is have the same standard of living or higher and use less energy, because if I have if I operate a coal plant, as I did, I operate a very efficient coal plant, but I did operate a coal plant. Every day you have someone whose job is to look at what the power price is going to be the next day and determine whether or not you can cost effectively run that plant. Now we converted that plant to gas, we made it a lot more efficient, and we were consistently more cleaner and cheaper than the grid on that. But you still have that agony as long as you're buying fuel. If you have a solar panel on your roof, you never worry about what the price of power is going to be the next day, because this thing costs you 0 cents to operate, mm-hmm. right? And so we've framed this as you can either have economic pleasures or environmental pleasures, and completely ignored how many win-wins there are in the system. And all of my business career was about going and finding those win-wins. And I think there's a larger problem. I mean, look, let's politicize this, but just because I think we have to. If you found you had an incurable disease tomorrow, and you were anxious and nervous about that, and your doctor said, "Look, I've read all the science. I'm a medical professional. This is what it says," and you said, "Well, I'm gonna go talk to my mechanic," and your mechanic looked at your charts and said, "Your doctor doesn't know what the heck he's talking about. It's the common cold. You've had ups and downs in your life before. You'll be fine." Number one, you probably wouldn't say, "Well, it's 50-50. Number two, you'd probably think like, why the heck does my mechanic have such firm opinions about this, right? Well, what do you do when the climate scientists and the business leaders say this is kind of a slam dunk, and a politician says, no, the climate's always been changing? You should treat that person with exactly the same respect you treat a mechanic who says you're not sick, right? And you should ask why they're being so adamant about that. They fundamentally don't understand it, and we give them too much credit just because they're in public office when they're talking about areas outside of their expertise.
Speaking about energy, Illinois has, I think it's the state with the largest percentage of its power needs that are met through nuclear power.
Mm-hmm.
Do you consider nuclear power to be clean energy? And what do you think the future of the nuclear power generation in the United States should be?
So number one, I think our energy policy has historically and fairly consistently made massive mistakes when it rewards paths over goals. What we need to do, we need to have a clean energy system, we need to have an affordable energy system, we need to have a reliable energy system, and I don't think there's any question but that nuclear plays a critical role in getting that done. At the same time, I think it's a huge mistake if government says, I am going to decide what technologies we should incentivize, reward, penalize, define the goals and let markets figure out what the right paths are. Mm-hmm. I think the challenge that the nuclear industry in the United States has today is that since the Public Service New Hampshire bankruptcy, which was the first time that a utility was ever allowed to go bankrupt for cost overruns, the entire electric sector has basically concluded that a nuclear plant is not a wise investment because they don't know if they can get the money out of it. And so we have a very old nuclear fleet that is running 90% capacity factor plus, is substantially responsible in many ways for the demise of coal in this country because nuclear is cheaper and because it's run so hard, it's knocked coal off the margin. But for the foreseeable future, I don't see any meaningful additions of new nuclear capacity in the country. And so and that's just a market question. That's not a policy and regulatory question. And in point of fact, the only countries that have really continued to invest in nuclear is ones that have taken much more top-down, path-dependent policies. China, Russia, France, being the three big ones. So I think we should need to make sure that the nuclear fleet that we have continues to run in a way that is safe and reliable. And yes, we have to deal with nuclear waste storage issues, but in the near term, if we were to decide that we want to abandon the U.S. nuclear fleet, two things would absolutely happen. Number one, we'd massively increase CO2 emissions because the coal plants would ramp up to pick up the back and all the rest that goes with coal plant pollution. That would mean that power prices would go up, which would be a problem. The second thing that would happen is we immediately would create a real problem with our military nuclear fuel supply because so much of the nuclear fuel supply chain is really managed jointly with our military and civilian nuclear forces. And there's a concern as we sit right now that as those nuclear plants age out and as the professionals who run those nuclear plants hit retirement, we're very close to being dependent basically on Chinese, Russian, and French nuclear fuel supply chains for a matter of national security. Mm-hmm. And that's a real challenge. Do we need to store the waste safely? Absolutely. But in the near term, I think we need to do our best to make sure that the fleet stays running safely and recognize that the goal of a low CO2 world is probably not going to be able to count on significant nuclear capacity additions in the next 10 to 15 years.
We're approaching 20 years since the United States invaded Afghanistan.
Mm-hmm.
We killed Osama bin Laden during the Obama administration. Our troops are still there. We still have troops in Iraq. Should there be some sort of amendment of the authorizations of use of military force in those countries? What's the path forward? Are we just going to be perpetually at war and occupying these countries?
Look, I voted to when the House passed the vote to rescind the 2002 authorization to use military force. That was the authorization to go into Iraq. That was the one that I think in hindsight everybody is kind of embarrassed by. That was the one that said Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. That was the one that said Saddam Hussein was responsible for the 9/11 hijackers. It's an embarrassment that stayed. I think that's the longest authorization to use military force other than the 2001. Now the 2001 is still there, and the 2001, to be clear, is the authorization to use military force against terrorism. Now, if you give me a time machine and go back, I think Colin Powell's advice at the time was right, that if you don't have a clearly defined goal and a clearly defined end state, There's a real problem with using that as an authorization to use military force. Repealing the Iraq one was really easy because we're not at war with Iraq anymore. Setting aside that the pretenses were false, Saddam Hussein is gone, right?
Wow.
So I think it's appropriate to repeal that one and go from there. I think with respect to the 2001, we have some really hard issues to deal with, and these are issues of our own making. And I got to go back to Colin Powell. Remember he said, you got the Pottery Barn theory, you break it, you own it. The hindsight's 2020. I don't think anybody was under any illusions that Saddam Hussein was a good guy. But I don't think anybody at the time who voted to invade Afghanistan, invade Iraq, quite contemplated the wisdom of Colin Powell's advice, because we've not replaced dictators with democracy, we've replaced dictators with anarchy. And so you now have these states where the ISIS's, the Al-Qaeda's, these forces that are here, we are now managing the mess that we substantially created, because instead of responding surgically to 9/11, we responded by destabilizing a whole region. We've made in weird ways Iran much happier, because Iran, who doesn't particularly care for Saudi Arabia, doesn't particularly care for Israel, now has a whole series of failed states that are easy for them to maneuver through between their border and those borders of those countries. And we're seeing the consequences of that play out, and the strike against Soleimani. So I'm not happy that the 2001 AUMF has to still stay in place, but I think until we have figured out how to in some way stabilize that region, we just need to maintain troops on the ground for the specific purpose of making sure that we disrupt these terror networks, and ideally provide some kind of a more State Department-led Marshall Plan to figure out how to recreate some stable governments over there, so that we don't have to be the world's peacekeeper.
How much time is enough? 30 years? 50 years? How long do we have to occupy that country?
Tell me how serious we're going to be about the occupation, and I can answer the timing. I think we focused vastly more on military solutions and vastly less on state solutions. I use the Marshall Plan seriously. We made a commitment in the Marshall Plan to rebuild those states. When Trump gets in and drops whatever he called it, the mother of all bombs, or that huge bomb, and then takes out Soleimani and turns people in the street against the United States, that's not stabilizing a region. That's just a small ego stroking itself, for lack of a better term.
Do you think the killing of Soleimani was misguided?
Massively.
Why?
Number one, I don't think we had any legal authority to do it. Trump had said that he justified it under the fact that we had the 2002 AUMF against Iraq. Soleimani was not an Iraqi national. Soleimani was someone we didn't like who happened to be in Iraq. And so if you can justify the attack on Soleimani by the fact that we have an AUMF against Iraq, what you're implicitly saying is that we have the authority to assassinate anyone we don't like should they set foot in Iraq. I think that is a really, really dangerous precedent. Moving separately from there, it shouldn't be lost on anyone that the Obama administration, the Bush administration, multiple Israeli administrations have had the ability to kill Soleimani and have consciously chosen not to do so because they don't want to destabilize the region. Soleimani was the head of the Quds force, which within the Iranian Defense Agency, Iran sees itself as being, in part a nation state and in part a caliphate that's going to expand their version of Islam out to the rest of the Middle East. The Saudis are not real wild about their version of Islam. And we know, and Iran knows that we know, that when their proxies act through Iran, we kind of know it's Iran, but we have plausible deniability if we don't want to get into a hot war. And so there was a real concern expressed by prior administrations that if you take out Soleimani, you will essentially encourage Iran to start acting through its proxies in ways that are going to be very provocative, because we're going to either have to admit that we know it was them and get into a hot war, or we're going to have to deal with the fact that Iran is going to push the pressure up and put us in a position where we're in a bad way.
What about the behavior of our proxies in Saudi Arabia? It hasn't been exactly honorable, has it?
I'm not saying we're honorable, but what I'm saying is that when we act as a country And look, there's plenty of errors all around. Like I'm not excusing the way that everybody's acted, but what I'm saying is that in terms of regional stability, this isn't a moral question. Like war is hell, right? I'm not making a moral argument for war. I'm simply saying that for the stability of the region, the Soleimani was viewed by the Iranian people, including those who don't like the regime, as a hero of Iran, a national hero of Iran. And we went from the Iranian street protesting against the clerics to protesting against America for violating international law. We went from a situation where Iran was not constructive but contained through the JCPOA and through some of our State Department efforts to where Iran now feels like this maximum pressure campaign is amping up and you are going to assassinate our citizens when we go overseas. And so you've seen this increase in attacks on U.S. embassies overseas through proxies, and it's significantly destabilizing. And I don't really know what we got out of it other than giving Trump a campaign slogan. The Quds Force still exists. Iran still doesn't like us, but the Iranian street is now more comfortable with what the clerics were doing than they were before.
So there has been a lot of legislation that has passed in the House, and in the Senate, they're not really approving anything that doesn't have unanimous consent.
I'd put it a slightly different way. The Senate has different procedural rules than the House, and one person can block a bill from coming to the floor in the House. I think what's McConnell has said, I think he said that I will be the graveyard. Those are his words for the House bills. I think it's worth asking the question of why is it that the bills that we have passed are overwhelmingly popular with the American public? If you go out and poll and ask, from assault weapons bans to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord to protecting the ACA to lowering prescription drugs, these are really, really popular bills. Campaign finance reform. If they were unpopular and McConnell didn't want them to pass, he'd bring them to the floor and they'd go down. I think the problem McConnell has is that the groups of donors that typically support his party don't like these bills, but the voters do. And he's got a real problem if they come to the floor. And I think that's really unfortunate because our democracy needs two parties who are committed to governance and committed to representing the people, not the donor class. But that's the challenge that we have. Now, the one silver lining in that is that when he said very early on, I'm not going to take any of your stuff up on the floor, he essentially sent a message to the House that there's no reason for us to do anything other than pass good policy. If we could do weak policy because a weaker policy might pass the Senate, maybe we could have cheapened him down a little bit. But when he said, I'm just not going to bring anything up, then we said, let's do good policy. So we've passed these bills. The significant majority of the bills that we've passed are bipartisan. And we've done the hard work to get them done. And I have a certain amount of anger that Senator McConnell has decided it's more important to spend his time confirming judges than to pass legislation. But like I said, if he didn't think that these bills would pass, he'd bring them to the floor.
So what's the way forward?
Do Senate leadership, unfortunately.
If things remain as they are, if the Republicans maintain control of the Senate and Democrats maintain control of the House, how important is it who is elected president?
I guess what I'd really encourage you and everybody to do is to not frame this through a bipartisan or a partisan lens. And again, maybe this is just my CEO talking. There's no other line of work where you say, how do you get things done? And the answer is, well, I've divided everybody into two teams. And the only way to get things done is to decide whether we have, how to get one team to be more cooperative. Like sometimes you win the game just by being the better team, not by counting on this team going through. And what strikes me in, look, the House flipped because 40 people like me won races. 40 people who represent the middle of the country, who flipped, historically sort of centrist districts, who represent centrist districts. 40 people like me who, with very few exceptions, don't come from prior political lives. They're former teachers, they're former CIA officers, they're former State Department officials, former university presidents, former doctors, former CEOs. This is our class, right? And with us coming in, my observation of what's happening in Congress right now, in both houses, is that the ideological diversity of the Democratic Party is really, really broad. Because we all of the middle is now represented by folks like me in our class. We've got the far left. We've also got Dan Lipinski, right? And we've also got Joe Manchin,
For now, yeah.
right? But I'm saying, like, there's a long ideological gap that runs across there that maps pretty closely to the ideological diversity of the country, right? If I told you you're going to have a party where there's going to be everybody in a rainbow that starts at AOC and ends at Joe Manchin in the room, like, you're probably going to find someone that most people would agree with within there. Yeah. That's come at the expense not of the Republican Party moving comparably to the right, as much as the Republican Party losing the middle and becoming very much more homogeneous on the right. And I think you can see in the votes in the 2016 election where the majority of people voted for Hillary. You can see in the votes in the 2018 off year where the majority of people voted for Democrats, that a government that represents the views of the American people is going to skew Democratic. The Senate, which really represents land, not people, skews Republican, and most of what we frame as partisan conflicts in Washington are really conflicts between the urban and suburban areas where people live and the rural areas where people don't live. So we have there's a ton of conversations where fundamentally, think about the last tax bill. The last tax bill created a massive wealth transfer with that SALT tax cap from the states that produce wealth like Illinois to the states that require subsidy to stay afloat like Wyoming and West Virginia. That's not representative democracy, but it's what's happened as a result of that. And so the question of how we get through this is tricky in a democratic system, because you can plant scenarios where greater and greater majorities of the American public vote for one party, and the Senate becomes more and more partisan as those areas depopulate but still have equal representation, right? And I think that is a real challenge we need to think through. It's not, if I had an easy answer, I'd give it to you. I don't have an easy answer to it. The Electoral College to some degree is the same thing, right? Trump's margin in the Electoral College was pretty close to George W. Bush's, but Hillary Clinton won by 3 million votes, and Al Gore won by 500,000 votes, I think, in the popular vote. And so it's a manifestation of the same thing. Whereas the population moves to urban and suburban areas, it's going to get harder. You're going to get a bigger and bigger popular vote total to get the Electoral College. And there's structural things we need to fix there. That's probably beyond the remit of a first-term congressman to fix. But I think we need to at least acknowledge them and figure out how we deal with this for the good of the American people, not for the good of one party or the other.
It's funny because I have not heard, maybe just in the past 2-4 years, the word socialism is used so much more, it seems like, in American politics than it was before. I mean, I don't remember, we have in Bernie Sanders, we have a candidate who calls himself a democratic socialist, and there's a lot of use of the term, probably as a derogatory term as much as, somebody actually coming out and saying that they're socialist. But, how much of a solution for this country is socialism? I mean, I think we'd be kidding ourselves if we acted like we didn't have any socialist programs in place already in this country. But is socialism an answer for some of the problems we're facing as a society? To what degree?
Look, socialism has become something we used to throw around the playground and call names at each other. I don't think it's a particularly enlightening conversation. I sometimes wish that everybody who throws around the name socialism would just go back and reread The Wealth of Nations. Because if you actually read what Adam Smith had to say, who's kind of invented the idea of capitalism, right, or at least sort of formalized it, he makes he basically makes the case for the mixed economy that the U.S. at its best has always been. There are parts of our economy that are very well suited to competition and market forces. And if you have a part of the economy that's well suited to that, my goodness, use it, because markets are so insanely efficient at allocating capital. And whether that's the manufacture of our cell phones, or some of the structural changes we've made to electricity markets, or going to buy avocados at the grocery store. There's a lot of things there where we can sit there and say, yeah, let's use market forces, let's get them to allocate capital. There are also parts of our economy, and again, Adam Smith kind of figured this all out. This isn't new stuff. I don't really want to have 4 competing militaries fighting for our fighting it out on cost, right? The mercenary armies are a bad thing. I don't want to have 4 police forces in the town. I think you can make a pretty compelling case that the privatization of prisons has been an unmitigated disaster, because you're not actually benefiting from competition. You're just putting a profit motive in something that is completely monopolistic by design, and you want it to be monopolistic by design. And so, there are, and then layered on top of all that, I think any government anywhere has some affirmative obligation to provide some base level of services. Every single one of us, I don't care how wealthy or poor you are, wants to know that if you get hit by a car and whisked off to an emergency room, they're going to treat you regardless of whether or not they first checked your wallet, right? And we all know that we're all one, tragic disaster away from having a disease we can't pay for, or, and we want to be educated. So of course there's going to be government services that we have to provide. And again, Adam Smith outlined all that stuff. That's the benefits of a mixed economy.
Medicare for all, do you support that?
I don't.
No.
And I don't support it basically for the same reason, that if you look at governments that have the highest quality health care, they all have some significant portion of competition in their system. And that's not to say they don't have universal health care. I absolutely support universal health care. But in the same way that our schools provide universal K through 12 education, but you still have choice about, do you go to public school, do you go to private school, do you go to parochial school, do you homeschool, do you move to go to the other town?
So
and that choice keeps discipline in the system.
Medicare is an option for all.
I think the ACA would have been much stronger if it had a public option in it, whether that's a Medicare option or otherwise, to go through. The other part, and I think there's a certain amount of naivete around Medicare for all. When we passed HR 3 did a lot of things, but the most significant thing it did was to take away the prohibition on Medicare negotiating with pharmaceutical companies to lower the cost of prescription drugs. Medicare had that right prior to the George W. Bush administration, and HHS at the time was successfully lobbied to take that away. And so since that time, Medicare hasn't had the ability to negotiate with drug prices. The idea that somehow if we make a government-provided system way bigger and way more inclusive, it's going to be less prone to lobbying and more efficient, I think is politically naive. But on the other hand, if you have a system that's government-run, and you have the option to go and buy into it, but you've got another option that you've got from your employer, your union, whatever else you've got, that keeps that system pretty disciplined, in the same way that the public schools in my town are good in part because they know that if they're not good, people might move to another town or send their kids to the parochial school or whatever else they do. So we need that competition in the system. And again, the countries that have the best health outcomes all have universal health care and all have competitive choice in the system.
Our state has legalized marijuana.
Mm-hmm.
It remains illegal at the federal level. It's probably not the best way to address this problem. I mean, you have businesses that are dealing in large amounts of cash. It makes them a big target for robberies. It's hard for them to bank the money. What should the federal government change the classification of marijuana? Should it become legal at a federal level? The way that things are set up now, I think we're up to, is it 11, 12 states that have legalized now?
Yeah, something like that.
When is the federal government going to address this issue, or should they?
So I was the I co-sponsored and we passed the Safe Banking Act, both out of financial services and on the floor. It was overwhelmingly bipartisan in both cases. And what that does is simply removes the prohibition on banking, because as it sits right now under the Know Your Customer rules, banks are not allowed to take deposits from somebody who's engaged in something that's federally illegal. Mm-hmm. So even in those states, as you said, you've got all cash businesses. If McConnell takes it up and the president signs it into law, we're good, but we've done our work in the House. I think there are two additional things we need to do, and my colleagues would agree, although I don't know what the status is because these are in committees that I'm not on. The first, which may seem fairly minor, but is actually, I think, significant from a business perspective, is that as long as marijuana remains federally illegal, we've solved the banking problem. But we still haven't solved the tax problem, because it's hard to figure out how you pay tax on an illegal enterprise. And what's happened is that under the bankruptcy code, if your revenue is coming from a source that's federally illegal, you have no legal liabilities, which means that anybody who's doing business with a cannabis-related company has no obvious standing in bankruptcy court. Are you a lender? Are you a supplier? Who gets paid first if there's an illiquidity event? And that really needs to be fixed through the Ways and Means Committee. I know they've discussed it. I don't know the status of that, but as long as it remains federally illegal, we have to do with that.
So I should just open a marijuana business and borrow money all over town and go bankrupt.
Well, frankly, what I've said to a lot of the local communities who are thinking about should we put a dispensary in our town is I've said, number one, you have to deal with the fact that until we fix the federal banking rules, you've got a cash issue. Mm-hmm. And number two, if you're a supplier to these businesses, you should probably ask them to prepay. Right? Because you just don't know how it's going to happen. And so that just sort of gums it up. Well, as long as until you can take the banking. The second thing, though, and this goes to sort of the federal legalization, the fact that all the states have led have put us in a position where the feds really need to follow, but we should move into a leadership role. The push for legalization, let's be honest, has come in part because it generates a lot of state tax revenues and helps states who have a difficult time. But because marijuana is illegal and is on the scheduled list of narcotics, nobody's been able to actually do the research to determine how does marijuana contraindicate with other things you may be taking? At what point in the developing brain is it problematic? We pretend we know that, right? So we've said, well, we're going to legalize for adult use, but we don't actually have any science that underpins what the definition of an adult is. Should pregnant women have a different requirement? If you're taking certain medications, we haven't done the research. And so I think we should decriminalize, because we just got way too many people in jail for low-level drug offenses, and by decriminalizing, deschedule it and do the research, and then have a more thoughtful and sort of scientifically informed process of legalization. I fear that by rushing to legalize first, we're going to create a huge, vested interest in legalizing and maintaining that's going to be hard to bring the science in after the fact. That piece of it, which would make all these other problems go away, is probably the politically hardest one to do, because you really can't have a conversation about decriminalization without having a conversation about amnesty for folks who are in prison right now for things that wouldn't be legal after the fact. And that is I wish that wasn't such a politically charged conversation, but in the current moment, letting people out of jail for low-level narcotics possessions would become a very politically difficult conversation. And so make me king and I can fix that. Leave me as a member of a parliamentary body, and I think it's going to take longer than it should to really do the federal decriminalization that we should be doing.
Has there ever been a king, Sean? One of the real strong takeaways that I got from the State of the Union speech by the president was he wants to take a hard line on immigration. He's going to go after sanctuary cities. We've seen specialized units from I think it's from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, but these sort of SWAT team type of guys that are coming into sanctuary cities. He's criticized Congress for failing to act on immigration reform issues. What should Congress do in terms of immigration reform? I think it's obviously been something we've looked the other way at for a very long time, and I don't think it's simply something that liberal interests have looked the other way at. I know that a lot of it's the prevailing wisdom that illegal immigrants will become future Democrats, but I think it also probably benefits businesses that can pay people less than minimum wage and they have no recourse. What is the way forward for immigration? What should Congress be doing about this issue?
Well, look, the first thing that I really wish everybody would do is go reread Reagan's farewell speech. When he in that was his shining city on the hill, and he said in that speech, the day America stops accepting immigrants is the day America stops being American. And it's just read it; it's inspiring, and this should not be a partisan issue. Just stick with the facts of it. Number one, if you look at crime statistics, it typically takes about 3 generations before an immigrant commits crime at the same level of a native-born American. People do not come to this country statistically to commit crime. They come here looking for a better life, and that's why we are as awesome a country as we are, because we are filled with people and their descendants who came here looking for a better life and willing to bust their butts to do it. That has always been true. Fact two, every objective analysis that I've seen is that that immigration, documented or undocumented, is a net gain to the economy. There's really no evidence that this is a drag on our economy. Folks come, they create businesses, even if they're not taxpayers. There's sales tax that they go through, and in aggregate, it's a net gain for the economy.
There's certainly concern, though, that they, quite frankly, they take jobs away from the native population.
No. Look, there's a concern. I'm just saying that the facts are what the facts are, right? I mean, are there individual cases? Of course, but in aggregate, the facts are what the facts are. Now, having said that, if you look at the history of our immigration policy ever since we had an immigration policy, the only consistent thing is that we've been racist. It varies who we've been racist to, right? We didn't like the Germans, we didn't like the Italians, we didn't like the Jews, we didn't like the Chinese, we didn't like the Japanese, we didn't like the Arabs. Today we don't like the Mexicans. Like, there's who we are racist towards varies with time, but we're always racist towards somebody. And we should probably fix that, right? We should probably recognize that there are gaps in the labor force in the U.S. economy that we can fill with immigration, and the skills that match to where the gaps in the labor force are not a function of where you come from. It's a function of what skills you bring to bear, and that's true at the high-skilled and the low-skilled end of the situation. To do immigration policy right, I don't think you can do immigration policy without also dealing with trade policy and also dealing with labor policy. Because exactly as you said, as long as we have undocumented immigration in this country, employers have a path to bring people in who will be willing to work at below market wages that create tension with folks who are working down at that same wage level. And we need to fix that. And I think the biggest thing we did this Congress on immigration policy was the modified Farm Bill, which provides a path to citizenship for migrant workers who come here who don't break the law. There's about 2 million people affected, so there's roughly 11 million undocumented folks in this country. We'd cover just about 20% of the undocumented population with the Farm Bill, because what it says is we know that employers are bringing these folks up. We know that this is their only source of labor, but when they come up here, they're getting paid subpar wages. That puts wage pressure on the rest of the system. Let's make sure that we fix that. They can do this legally, and then those folks have a path to citizenship. So we should do that, and we also need to, we need to have a much more honest conversation about what the undocumented population in this country is. You got to go back to, I think, before the Obama administration, certainly the very beginning of Obama's first term at the latest, to get to a point in time where the majority of undocumented folks in this country were from border crossings. The majority of the undocumented people in this country entered the country legally and overstayed their visa. And we
interrupt you, but do you feel that we are doing an adequate job of protecting our border?
The
our southern border specifically.
Look, you cannot have a viable country that can't police and protect its borders. And so we absolutely need to have a screen on who comes in. But statistically, we don't really have a big problem with illegal border crossings. I mean, even all the stuff that Trump has talked about, these are overwhelmingly dominated by people getting to the border and seeking refugee status, right? That's not an illegal person entering the country. That's someone's coming up and saying, please, I would like to come in, process my application, here's my background, and then we have the gall to separate them from their children and put them in cages. We are behaving horribly irresponsibly there, but that is not an undocumented citizen. That is someone who is coming here and saying, I'm in a detention facility, which we should have detention facilities. They should be humane, they should be respectful, we should have the resources to process people through the courts, and if there's a problem, send them back. If they're acceptable, let's bring them in, right?
So, I mean, do we have the facilities to accommodate those people as it stands?
Well, so this is just a tragedy. So when we had this influx of people at the border, and number one, let's look at the root causes of the influx. Part is the war on drugs, because we've gone after the war on drugs in Central America because we kept demanding drugs, and we moved from Colombia to the Caribbean to Central America. And then the Trump administration pulled about $200 million of State Department aid out of the Golden Triangle, which allowed the gangs to take over in those countries, destabilize the regions, and then you had these people fleeing for their life. Had we invested in the diplomatic sources that Congress had already approved, we might not have had the refugee crisis at our border. However, now you've got the folks who are coming up, and sorry, I've lost my thread. Remind me what your question was that I just started off on there.
Oh, I was asking about border crossings and if we're doing a good enough job of securing that border.
So anyway, so those folks are up there, and that's the cause of the folks who are on the border. This is on the detention facility question. So we then had them in these detention facilities. You remember these stories about no soap, no heat, no toothbrushes. Yeah. So we then authorized. Well, no. So we then authorized a $4 billion program, which was a little bit politically contentious, and some on the far left said, "Why are you approving funding for these detention facilities?" We did it because with an influx of refugees coming in, you need to have the facilities to detain them humanely, and we then built out these really nice detention facilities. The Trump administration then said we're going to shift to a remain in Mexico policy and is not allowing those people to cross the border and staying in Mexico. That is a completely clear violation of international law, because what we're doing is creating these camps that are targets for human traffickers, for sex traffickers, for drug smugglers. It is a completely horrible and inhumane thing to do, and there's a reason why it's a violation of international law. The Trump administration has violated international law, period. It is an embarrassment. So we now do we have facilities? We do, and they're empty. And shame on us for allowing that to happen. We're doing what we can in Congress from an oversight role, but the executive branch authority that's there. But the last thing I just wanted to say was that when you have the overwhelming majority of undocumented folks in this country being visa overstays, and stipulate that we want to make sure that we have controls over who comes into our country, addressing that problem is a really hard conversation about civil liberties. If the majority were coming across the border, then we could talk about walls and border security. But that's a Trump campaign promise for an imaginary problem for all practical purposes. If you're concerned about undocumented folks in this country, then we need to talk about how much do we want to track the free movement of people in this country. China does it, right? They put cameras all over, they can track where you are. I don't want to live in that kind of a world. I don't want our country to be that. But if you are truly concerned about the undocumented population in the United States, you got to have that conversation about, do we want to revisit how we think about civil liberties? It's not about a wall.
You've been really generous with your time. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Got to ask the question, but what have you been able to bring home to the folks in the 6th during your time in Congress so far? We're all looking for...
there's a couple things. There's some things that I think are meaningful. We got a $14 million grant approved for a train station in Glen Ellen and some upgrades that are out there.
I was at that train
station.
Yeah.
So that was kind of cool. We got a $1 million grant for World Relief. That's a refugee resettlement program down in Wheaton, and then there's also just some, one of my favorite stories, and I think I have to be a little bit careful to share names here, but we have the constituent services activity is so neat. We had a gentleman in the district who served in World War II, was part of the atomic vets. He was on one of the ships that was testing nuclear weapons in the Bikini Atoll, and he told a story that he they told him to cover their eyes, and so he covered his eyes, put his arm in front of his face with his eyes closed, and he could see the bones in his arm.
Okay.
He was told afterwards, it was all classified, he was told afterwards, never have kids, never get married, because you've been pretty scrambled up genetically. And he never did. He's now married, or his girlfriend, not married because, in part because of what the Navy said, and he's only got so many years left. And asked if there was anything we could do to help, and we went through and found some programs that he didn't know about, and we're able to get him $70,000 from the Atomic Vets program so that he can leave his longtime girlfriend with a few resources when he passes on. And that kind of stuff. It's just awesome to be able to provide some little degree of help in this capacity to do that. I think on a non-financial level, the thing that I'm most proud of is that we've been available. I think particularly in this moment, people want to understand what's going on. That I've done these 26 and counting town halls, not just because I made a pledge to be available, but because in this moment, people are really nervous about what's going on. And I did, after the Soleimani strike, I did a town hall just about Iran. Everybody was nervous to know what's going on with Iran. I need to know, and fortunately, I'd had the benefit of, getting briefings from Obama's former national security advisor or deputy national security advisor and security advisor, Susan Rice and Ben Rhodes, from the current administration, from other people, and was able to sort of walk through, this is what's going on, so that you know. After the Mueller report came out, we did a whole town hall on impeachment to sort of walk through, what does the special prosecutor statute say, what was this written, what was the mandate of what Mueller was allowed to look into, what did he not look into. And all of these things are not to persuade people that I have all the right answers, but I think to make sure that we're working from a common set of facts. And it's a true privilege to be in a position to share those common set of facts. It is humbling that after 26, these people keep showing up, as presumably they want to hear. But I think particularly at this moment of tension, we have an obligation to, where we can, try to let the air out of the balloon a little bit and get people to understand, are there things to be concerned about? Yeah, there are. But let's make sure that we're not going down rabbit holes of conspiracy theories, that we do have a common set of truths. And I'm just really proud that we've been able to do that and maintain that presence in the district.
Okay. Well, thanks a lot for your time.
Thank
if
you.
there was anything you wanted to talk about, you didn't get the chance to.
As you imagine, I could ramble for a long time here, but I appreciate you guys taking the time yourself.